about a new book that he has written. It's called Chasing Love, Relationships, Sex, Love, and Relationships in a Confused Culture. I have it right here. And I have actually read this book and reviewed it already. I've already given my daughter a copy. She's a teenager. And I know from doing campus ministry for the last 15 years, apologetic ministry, that one of the main issues that comes up and one of the main objections to the faith is the issue of sexuality. It's in the top three, I'd say, besides
Yep.
hell and why has God allowed suffering and other issues. But this is really in the top three issues. And so if you're going to talk to anybody about the faith today, especially the younger generation, you're going to have to deal with this issue, maybe the older generation too. But the point is that you need to get this book, get it on Kindle, but it's a great book. It's short, it's accessible. The chapters are easy to understand. There's questions after each chapter. You can go through this with your teenagers or whatever, but I highly recommend it. You can get it on Amazon. It's called Chasing Love, Sex, Love, Relationships in a Confused Culture. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight with Sean. And Sean, let me ask you a question. Let's just jump right in. Now, in the mid 90s, and I came to faith, I seem to recall, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think the purity movement was still kind of big in the mid 90s. Your dad had the Why Wait campaign. Was that going on at that time in the mid 90s? I think it was, wasn't it?
Well, the Why Wait campaign actually started in the 80s,
In the 80s.
mid
I'm behind.
80s.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It was the very first global sexual purity campaign. And it actually bled into True Love Waits, which started in 1993. And my dad was not formally tied to that organization. It went a little different direction than he had originally envisioned it. But keep in mind, I was born in 76. So
Okay.
he is starting this abstinence campaign while my hormones are kicking in. So I'm like test case number one for this stuff. But I also think it gives me a unique perspective looking back now, having heard the heart of that message and growing up with it. How does it need to change? What was positive? How's the conversation adapted since then, et cetera?
Okay. So when I became a believer in 1994. I was about 24 years old. Everybody was kind of focused on. Soon I was single, of course, and everyone's like, "You got to get married." I mean, you know what I mean. I mean, if you're a believer, you got to be married. I mean, if you're not married, something's wrong with you. It seems like it was almost a little bit of an obsession. And then the purity movement was kind of there, and then this thing, that was focused, that was there as well in the background, trying to stay pure. So where did I know you've done a lot of research on, so where did the purity movement go right and where did it go wrong? Like, what are some of the pros and the cons of it that you'd say where we're at now?
So one of the terms that's used is purity culture.
Okay.
And typically organizations and groups that are tied to that would be like Joshua Harris, I Kiss Dating Goodbye. Sometimes James Dobson is added to that. Not typically, but occasionally my father, because he was even before some of purity culture. It's really like mid 90s into the 2010s. Movements like True Love Waits, Silver Ring Thing. And that's what's called purity culture. Now, the problem is, in some ways, purity culture has basically become any bad experience somebody had in the church or from a book that they feel harmed them in terms of their relationships and sexuality gets lumped into this nebulous term, purity culture.
Okay.
So there are some commonalities that you'll find there. But when I've read the different studies critiquing purity culture, there's a range of different voices and different approaches kind of lumped in together. So critique of A might not be a critique of B. So for example, like True Love Waits wasn't against dating. Joshua Harris was, and yet they're both lumped into purity culture. So with that said, there's a few things that I think purity culture got right. Number one, that sex is kind of a big deal. It actually matters, and we needed to address sexuality and dating with this generation. Second, it should be biblically based, right? These are some things that purity culture got right. Some things that it got wrong. I mean, I have a list of probably a dozen things. I'd say a few of them, but the biggest one is people will talk about what's called the sexual prosperity gospel.
Mm-hmm.
That basically people are told, not necessarily in these words, but if you just keep yourself sexually pure now, and that at least means keep yourself technically a virgin, then you will get married and have endless sexual bliss someday in the future and be rewarded for this. Now, again, people didn't word it that way, but the message was God has that spouse out there for you. You got to find it and find him or her.
Right.
and then you're just going to get blessed the rest of your life. Well, then you have some people looking back going, I'm still single. Nobody talked about this. Yeah, people looking back going, hey, actually, I did the right things and I got married, and this marriage thing's been harder than I imagined. You have some people that are divorced. Some people lost their spouses. Like, there's a generation of people looking back saying, I'm not sure this was as holistic of a message as it could be.
Hmm.
Another critique is that, ironically, um, this is in a book, I forget her first name, last name is Gardner, and it's an academic study called Making Chastity Sexy. And she
Okay.
says, sex is used to sell everything from soap to cars to burgers. And ironically, sex is used to sell abstinence as well.
Right.
And
Right.
I'm like,
Right.
I think they're right about this. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch more critiques we could go into than this that didn't address the LGBTQ conversation,
Hmm.
not a lot of conversations about sex abuse. But I also, in fairness, I look back and we have to remember the times that some of purity culture came out of. We have to look at where the conversation was then. And I definitely recognize that there were some theological and practical mistakes, but I also have a lot of grace for people looking back, doing the best with what they had at that time.
Okay. So would you say that in a way, you say this in your book, by the way, I noticed you had a little sentence on this. Do you think we kind of idolized, we portrayed marriage as a little bit of an idol, the whole thing was kind of idolized, the whole thing. Would you agree? I mean, the whole
Uh,
package.
yeah, no question about it. And so I would say yes. I could launch into that, but I sense
Right,
you were
right,
taking
right.
that question.
I have a book called The Marriage Idol on my shelf. Have you read that book? Anyway, yeah, anyway, I've read it and reviewed that one too. Anyway, he's got some interesting points. I figured you already have it, but okay. Well, that's great. Now let's talk. We just had a very contentious election, as you know, and I'm not going to go into one thing we're not going to cover tonight a lot is the gay topic because I have Christopher. How do you say it? Is it Jan or
You
Yan?
on.
Yeah, he's coming on in a few weeks, so he'll just
That's
totally take
great.
that. I know you like him. I know you've had him on your show as well. And by the way, Sean has great clips if you look up his YouTube clips. Let's talk a little about transgenderism. So this is on everybody's mind. With the election that just happened, some of the legislation is going to be passed, maybe the Equality Act. I mean, what do we do as parents and Christians in this situation? I'll give you an example. So I have a teenage daughter. She's 17 and she's involved in sports, and maybe other parents do as well. You have kids. So what do you tell your kids like when they start enforcing these rules, what I mean? Or there is no rules, transgenderism is totally, it's equal and everything, and they can be on sports teams and locker rooms and all this stuff, where we're headed as a country. How do we exercise compassion, but yet kind of like, like this is just not right. You know what I mean? Like, I know there's gender dysphoria and things like that, but where do we go from here? And where do you see it going now that where we're headed is after the election, what our new president's doing?
Well, there's cultural questions here, there's
Yeah.
theological questions, there's ministry questions. Where I see it headed is a whole bunch of court cases coming down the pike for the rest of this presidency and maybe beyond, of what this means for female sports, what this means for education and private schools, what this means for churches. So I'm not a legal scholar, but
Right.
what I understand is there are some rights that have been secured in the Supreme Court, and some of those have been tested a little bit. But this new Equality Act that is coming down is basically putting, as far as I understand it, any federal funds or influence with gender and biological sex on the level of race. You cannot make any distinctions. Housing, sports, etc., education. So we're going to start to see this play itself out, and a lot of lawsuits are going to come from this, legally speaking. For the church, I don't know what that means. What does it mean for where I teach at Biola? What does it mean for Ratio Christi? What does it mean for a church in tax exempt status? I honestly don't know the answer to that. I don't know what to expect. I
Right.
think the other side wants to crush and silence and basically put anybody who says your gender identity should be tied to your biological sex in the category of Nazis that are killing people. I'm not saying everybody who embraces some kind of transgender ideology wants to do that, but those with power and influence, that's what they would aim to do. Now, whether that happens or not, I really don't know the answer to that. I'm not a prophet and I work at a nonprofit organization, so I can't answer it. But
And don't be giving prophecies anyway. So
there you go.
we
But the
saw where the lecture
writing,
went with that one.
the writing is on the wall that these battles are only beginning.
Right. But
So
you see, I
my
mean, what's happened now, it's going to be, I mean, it's more intense now already. Like last week,
I don't
last
think there's any question about that heating up.
Right. Okay. That's what I thought. All right. So let me ask you a question about the issue in your book. So you talk about God's view of sexuality and our biblical view of sexuality, and you would agree that the reason a lot of young people, or just people in general, reject it is because they don't think God is good. They don't really trust God's design. I mean, how do we, I mean, a biblically and theologically illiterate culture around us, like, how do we communicate to people like, would you consider God's view of this to be good? Could you even put it on the table? I mean, he's a good God and he has a good plan for us. I mean, how do you get people to that place in your experience?
So there's a difference between talking with students who are Christians and rooting a sexual ethic in God's good character and
Mm-hmm.
speaking to somebody who's not even a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Those are different things.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm speaking to a non-Christian, I'm probably, I can go angles where I could talk about how a biblical sexuality is good for society as a whole. But you're still going to bump up against these deep-seated intuitions that say, as long as I feel something, it's right for me. As long as I decide something, it's right for me. And this denial of biological sex, a thwarted view of marriage, like you're going to run up against some of those ideas. So in many cases with non-believers, I want to talk about who is Jesus first. Is Jesus good? His love for the marginalized, his character, and then we can get to some of these sexual issues down the line. I think you see Jesus in Mark chapter 2 dining with the sinners. He knew in a sense they needed his medicine, his grace before they could live differently. Doesn't mean I don't have conversations with people about these topics, and I do, and I enjoy it. But my strategy is like, I realize this person's not going to believe probably the right things about marriage in many circumstances until they understand that there's a God who designed us and he has a certain authority over us and what he says matters and is important. So a friend of mine who's a Christian went to visit his friend who is his brother who's gay, who's not a Christian, walks in to deliver something. His friend is sitting there with a bunch of his friends who are gay. And one of them goes, "Hey, you're a professor, right? You teach apologetics." He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "So what do you think about homosexuality?" In front of a bunch of non-Christians who are gay. Now, I don't know what I would have answered right there, but I'll tell you, my friend nailed it. He goes, "Look, I'm happy to talk about that and what Jesus' view is, but let me ask you a question first. If there were a God who existed and designed us to live a certain way, would you be open to evidence and proof that this God is real?" They're like, "Sure." So he starts to talk about the evidence for God's existence and then downstream gets to the questions of what that means for our behavior. It's not avoiding the question, it's keeping the main thing the main thing. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that approach. Now, with Christians, what I want to do is help them realize they're not supposed to be sexually pure because of what they get out of it. We're to be sexually pure even if it costs us something. At the heart of it is the question, is God good? And are his commands for our good? And we could talk about how we know that, but I think we look at the person of Jesus, look at passages like Deuteronomy 10, where Moses says, "These commandments I give to you are for your good." Psalms 119, when David says he rejoices in the law of the Lord. So for Christian kids, at the heart of it is they feel like God's sexual ethic is just antiquated and doesn't relate to their life. Let's get back to the person and character of God and root his commandments in who God is.
Okay. So would you kind of tie that in with my next question as I kind of play devil's advocate? I know you've heard this, but someone comes to you, they're a Christian and maybe young, not married yet, or maybe they are in a different situation. I don't know, but they say, Sean, it just is not fair. God has given me, he gives us all these desires. I'm talking about heterosexual. I'm not necessarily talking about the gays, but it could apply to that too, the gay topic. But God's given me all these desires. I want intimacy. I want the physical intimacy. I want all this stuff. and I have no way to get it. And he's asking me to be pure my whole life. It just seems like it's cruel. He's given us these inward desires. They're so strong, and I can't get that need met. And it just seems like he's bootstrapping me, you know what I mean? And so would you just have to keep going back to the issue of we just keep God's character, you can trust God, trust God, trust God. It's going to be hard, or just talk about self-denial. Sometimes the Christian life isn't easy, about self-denial.
I think what I would do when somebody said it to me, I'd say, what, before I try to give an answer, would you tell me a little bit more of your story? When did
Mm-hmm.
you come to feeling this sense of same-sex attraction? How has this affected your relationships? Help me understand where you're coming from before I give a simplistic answer that maybe won't connect with your life experience.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I would try to do is I would say, these desires that God has given us for sexual intimacy, for relationships, these are all good desires. It's not that at its core, our desires are bad. But what God does do is he cares about how we express and live out these desires. That's an important distinction I would make. And third, I'd say, what? I'm married, but what I can do is point you to some people like Christopher Yuan. If you really want to know how to be faithful to what scripture teaches and live it out in your life, Wesley Hill, Christopher Yuan, Rachel Gilson, there are models of Christians who have gone before you and are living this out today. Let's get one of these books and study it and talk about it together is probably how I would approach something like this.
What would you say about the heterosexual though? That's just like well, oh yeah, I want to tie this in with the next question. We'll just tie this here. So singleness and marriage. Where have we gone wrong in the church on dealing with singleness and marriage? Now, I was a new believer in the mid-90s. It was like, youth group singles, like, come to the singles group. I call youth pastor, like, do you have a singles ministry? Yes, come 7 p.m. It seems like we had everything was bracketed. You know what I mean? Bible study, singles. And so where have we gone wrong as far as dealing with that issue? You have 2 chapters in your book, by the way, on being single. So that's why I bring this up.
Yep.
So where have we kind of gone wrong on that? Where could we do better on addressing the issue of singles and marriage, like that whole dynamic? What would you say?
Well, I think we've gone wrong theologically and we've gone wrong practically.
Okay.
So theologically, back to one of the earlier points you made, Eric, that we kind of assume everyone's supposed to get married. And that's like the A prize that God will reward you with for faithfulness.
Right.
Well, theologically, scripture doesn't teach that. Look at the teachings of Jesus in Matthew 19 and Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. Singleness and marriage are 2 equal ways of honoring God and loving other people. They're both gifts to the church. They both have their strengths. They both have their weaknesses.
Right.
This is what scripture teaches. We've gotten that completely out of kilter. We don't talk about, I ask my students, I've done this a number of times. Can you give me an example of a sermon you've heard theologically on the goodness and beauty and role of singleness? And it's like hardly anybody has. How many of you heard one on marriage? Dozens and dozens and dozens. Well, something's just gone out of kilter. Now, people who come to the church, we do appeal to younger families with kids. So I understand practically why this happens, but theologically, there's no excuse for it. So that's one problem. And then practically, like you said, we have singles groups where it's kind of like the B, C, D, F, or Z prize that frankly, some of my friends in singles groups tell me are basically dating places where somebody's waiting to get their spouse. That's a problem. It's like, go to the singles group over there. But also when somebody's like 30 years old and they're single, it's like, hey, I'm going to connect you with somebody else. We start getting suspicious of people rather than seeing Jesus was single, Paul was single, and it's a gift for the church. So I haven't seen a lot of churches that integrate singleness naturally and beautifully in a good fashion that matches what scripture actually teaches. And today, when less and less Gen Zers and millennials are getting married, and those who do are getting married later, we better recover a biblical theology of singleness and start incorporating it into the church very, very quickly.
I agree. 100%. Quick joke. When I went to the singles group before I was married, my the youth pastor said, you can come, but most people do, they walk up to the door at the window in the middle, they peek in, look to see if they see anybody interesting, and then they just turn around and bail. So, that's what I was told. He said, now if you're interested in that, you can come, but that's what most people do. So you can check it out, through the window, and then, if you see anything, anyway, you're interested in. Anyway, that was a long time ago. We won't go into that. Okay. So, all right. So let me ask you, we got maybe a couple more questions quickly, then I have to get to some,
Sure.
we have a lot of time. What about this issue of someone that comes to you? Okay. So the goal for the being pure is we're trying to talk to people about, not being sexually, physically active till they get married. Being a virgin, all that stuff. But you say in their book, you've had people come to you and say, well, Sean, how far is too far? Like I can, still do some stuff, and I can do this and do that, but as long as I don't do that big thing, you know what I mean? And so I will say that is an issue out there. I've dealt with it too. What do you say to that? What does it mean to be purity, like the purity thing that you're defining, biblically speaking? What's it
So,
cover?
so let me take a step back here. At the heart of this book, I'm talking about loving God with our body and loving God with our souls.
Mhm.
Sometimes we've talked about virginity. If you just stay a technical virgin, and maybe oral sex counts, maybe it doesn't. Well, but still, that's much better. So somebody could not have physical sex, but look at porn, have a thought life full of lust, and still be considered, well, technically I'm a virgin. This is a good thing. I want to say, okay, time out. I'm less concerned exactly how we define virgin or non-virgin. Like, why are these categories so central to how we think about sexuality? Rather, what does it mean to love God and love other people with our bodies and with our souls? And when we start to ask the question that way, rather than how far is too far, how close can I get without crossing some barrier, it shifts it to what does it mean to love this human being in body and soul that I am in relationship with? So a lot of times guys are told, hey, when you look at a girl, quickly look away, like train your eyes to dart so you don't lust. I'm like, okay, what if we train our eyes that when you look at a girl and you find yourself attracted, rather than saying, oh, I'm going to dart because that's an object, somebody I don't want to objectify. How do I let that person go, wow, that is somebody in body and soul that I want to love and honor. And what does that mean? In my body and my soul. Do you see how different of a way of thinking that is?
Mhm.
That's what I'm trying to bring in this book for people to wrestle with and think through.
Okay. Yeah. So would you say that you deal with a lot of youth and everything? Would you say in all the apologetic questions you get and objections, would you say if what you're seeing in this current generation is sexuality, like sexual purity and all those issues, is that like in the top like two or three that people are wrestling with that still all the time? Is that the main kind of thing? They're wrestling, well, Christianity's outdated and their view of sexuality is outdated and the Bible's outdated and I'm moving on. Do you feel like that's all combined into one thing? Is it one of the top issues today that people are wrestling with constantly?
I don't think people are wrestling with the question of sexual purity. I've
Okay.
chosen to still use the term purity because we see it show up in the scriptures. How can a young man stay pure, have thoughts that are blameless and pure and worthy of praise? So I still use the term. I think the larger question is yes, sexuality, but it's how do I live out my Christian faith when I'm told I'm bigot and homophobic and hateful and killing people who have a different sexual orientation? Why on earth would the Bible say two men can't get married? That looks like love. They seem happy to me. Those kinds of questions are more pressing than sexual purity, so to speak, in the minds of the larger culture. And frankly, a lot of our Christian kids are just like, they don't even know how to be in relationship with their friends who see the world very differently and hold a very secular mindset.
And
That's
we
some of
were
the challenges.
Yeah, when we were on campus last fall, one day we got in a conversation. There's a campus preacher came out, got a bunch of people mad. So we pulled away about 15 to 16 students, a friend of and me. We started talking to them, and sexuality came up. That's all they want to talk about. Ask us questions about views and sexuality.
Yep.
And the one thing that comes up a lot of times is, is love. Well, they're
Mm.
love, two people love each other. It's love, 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 love. So I'm sure that you probably pose this question back to them is how are they defining love? And so how do you think we should communicate what love is? Since it's so important to them, like it's about love. It's all about love. What do you think we should say to that?
I think our culture sometimes gets love right, and sometimes it gets love wrong.
Okay.
So it gets love right in, say, the Avengers movie. Sorry to ruin it for any of you, but you've had time to see Infinity War and Endgame
I've seen it 18 times. Go ahead.
18
That's all that
times
matters.
at
No,
least,
I
which
don't know.
is
At least 18.
at least.
Go
So that's
ahead.
like 54 hours of your
No,
life. That's a
no,
long
no.
time.
I mean, I flip through the channels sometimes. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, Iron Man is this Christ like figure who lays down his life, so to speak. Jesus said, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for a friend. So there's a sense where, scripturally speaking, that movie matches up with a biblical ethic of love. But then there's other times where love is like to affirm whatever somebody believes and however they feel. That's where we go, okay, time out. I can't buy that definition of love. So I guess I would say two things. I would assume that people, since they're made in the image of God, really do intuitively want and understand what love should look like. That's why people loved the ending of Endgame, because it's this heroic act of love, sacrifice for others. So I assume in a presuppositional way that people made in the image of God know and yearn for love. But I also assume they're deeply confused by all these lies being passed in our culture about affirmation. So I might do one of two things. I might talk about, say, hey, give me your definition of love, and just talk about, how do you define love? What does it mean? We all talk about love. We all want it. We're quick to label other people haters. But what does love actually mean? Give me your definition and understanding of love. And I found few people can actually define it. And I'll say, okay, here's my understanding of love, that love is to be committed to the best of another human being, even if this person doesn't recognize it. I'm committed to the emotional, spiritual, relational best of another human being, even if they don't recognize it. Do you agree? Why? Why not? So the bottom line is, I want to have a conversation about how you define love. What is love? Sometimes I'll say, give me an example from a movie or from culture where you have seen the greatest act of love, and tell me why you think that is love. And it's just a practical way with somebody who you can't point towards scripture, starting to unpack and discuss what love is, how do we recognize it, and what does it mean. So tactically, that's where I would go in conversation.
And it's interesting, like you said, a lot of the movies, the most popular movies, all involve some sort of sacrificial character. Lord of the Rings, Avengers. It's all
Yeah.
it's all got the same theme.
Yep.
Okay, well that's good. Well, since we get Sean only for an hour tonight, he's a busy guy. I'm gonna not ask a ton of more questions. I'm gonna open it up to people to ask some questions. So go ahead and unmute yourself if you're asking a question. But like I said, not everyone unmute yourself. So let's go ahead and ask some questions. Chris, I want to go to a guy named my friend Chris. I know he's here somewhere. I think he has a question for you if he wants to ask it first. Chris, you there? Chris?
Yes, I'm here, but my children are in the room, so I'm just going to let other people ask. Well,
Okay.
let me speak in code. I'll speak in code.
Okay.
So, Sean, just Eric and I have been friends for a long time. Your dad's book, More Than a Carpenter, was one of the first books I ever read when my faith was challenged. 1994 was when I came to know the Lord. I was 22, lived a really rock and roll lifestyle up until then, and just fell in love with your dad's stuff, and that's what got me started in apologetics. So I just want to extend that thanks to
Thanks for saying that.
yeah, man. Anyway, so I've been in Ratio Christi. I've been with campus ministry. I teach philosophy part-time at a community college, so I've been dealing with young people. I've had my own struggles too. I'm 48. So how do you how do you talk to like these young men who struggle with lust and struggle with their thought life or the dreaded M word? Not going to say it out loud because my children are present here. Um, and you kind of hinted at that with, you know, your relationship with God. But I was just wondering if you could maybe supplement that with something. And uh, you know, because as Eric said, you know, the
Sure.
hormones are so strong and overwhelming at that age. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's the hormones, and you add smartphones to the mix and the ubiquity of pornography. I mean, I literally just told my wife I was working on a talk and I was searching something, and bam, these images just pop up. I'm like, dear Lord, it's just so fast. It's out of nowhere. We're bombarded by this stuff. Well, that's even more so for generation raised with this and been conditioned by this. So I guess I would do a couple things. And by the way, this M question, even though since your kids are there, when I'm talking to young people, I will use the words, and I don't know how old your kids are, which is fine, but I was speaking to 6th and 12th graders, and this high school senior stands up in front of the entire school and goes, "Hey, so what do you think about the M word?" Just says it. And I just comfortably respond back. I don't freak out, like just show, hey, these are real questions. Good for you. Thanks for asking this. So these are on the hearts and minds of this generation. So my first thing is just to be comfortable with where we stand and just not freak out and just kind of have these conversations with people. The second thing is we got to have a ton of grace. The last thing I want to do is just shame somebody because of a sexual habit or brokenness. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2 or 4, it talks about, sin just creates this cycle that just builds and grows, and it becomes a defeatist attitude. So I want to shower this in grace and love and acceptance. Anytime a young person has told me they struggle with porn, I just always say, gosh, thank you for telling me. Can't imagine how much that would have taken, especially if it's a Christian kid. Just know that I love you and we're going to work this through together. You don't have to worry about that. So show a ton of grace. Then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start asking a lot of questions. I'm going to say, okay, how does it make you feel? How do you make sense? And I don't mean like the sexual release. They're going to say, oh, it feels good. I mean, how does it make you as a human being feel as a Christian? Because talk to a lot of young people, there's a tension there in their heart. They kind of know, I just don't know that this is what God wants me to do and how he wants me to behave. So I'm going to ask a lot of questions to sense where they're at. Realize, here's my basic concern. Christians land on all sides of this issue, which surprised me when I researched this book and got to that question. There's a lot of conservatives who are like, I don't have a problem with it if there's no lust involved. If there's lust, clearly because the Sermon on the Mount, we can rule that out. But some people say, well, if it's just a biological process and there's no lust, why is it wrong? And I think my response would be to say, sex is designed by God to be outward focused on another, not for our own individual pleasure. That's what the body reveals, and that's God's design for sex in marriage. So my concern would be, is doing the M word regularly going to condition habitually somebody in a way that it can become a habit and potentially an addiction, and also shape the way you relate to somebody sexually? And I think it can, and it does. So again, with grace, without shame, what does it mean to be a Christian in which we've submitted everything to the Lord and we're free from some of these kind of temptations of the world? Now, a lot of that's going to say, okay, let's get certain software on our phone. Let's think through some of the ways things we look at and the music we listen to and how that may potentially affect us without being legalistic, being wise. Those are the kind of conversations that I'm going to have over time just to help this young person hopefully get some freedom from that in their life.
Okay. I think Chris is probably happy with that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And yeah, my youngest is 10 and my wife is here. So I'm just trying to
No, I get it.
I speak
get it.
candid. I'm very candid person. My wife will
Good.
tell you that. So, hey, thank
I
you.
agree.
For that.
10's on the borderline with that. So thanks for asking.
Right. Thank
Okay.
you.
And someone's writing in the chat room anything that needs clearing up. So we've done that. We're taking care of that M word. Anyway. Okay. Who's next? Who wants to ask a question to Sean? Sam, go ahead.
Sean, when I heard of that book you called Love God with Your Body, I wonder you're familiar with the book, which I think is in the 1980s by John Paul II, The Theology of the Body.
Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
Mm-hmm.
I think he gives some very good pointed thing because it's all about the image of God. And then just say if you watch pornography, he said you are watching the image of God, supposed to be cherished, the image of God, and then you have turned it into an object of consumption. That person is no longer a real person, you turn it into an object. And then I think it's very good, he pointed out the distinction of appreciation of beauty. So you can look at a nude painting or a nude sculpture in a marble sculpture or a beautiful person, be able to appreciate it, but there's a distinction between that and lust. Of course, if you're 16 years old, I don't think there was such a distinction.
Yeah, that's a little tougher, admittedly.
That need a very mature person before you can get that distinction. But I think it'll be good, that kind of thing, teach in a very, in a church. It's not like, I think sometimes we mix with appreciation of beauty and lust. And some people talk to me, I say, well,
Yeah.
that is lust. This is God giving us the gift of appreciation of beauty. Don't lump me in there. You're not guilty.
Yeah, Sam, let me jump in here to answer your first question. I've read The Theology of the Body. It's very long. One of the top books I would recommend is called Theology of the Body, but by Christopher West, who sums up the teaching of John Paul II. That was a game-changing book for me. And if I might, just because I want to try something out for fun, I think we can potentially make a case against premarital sex without using the scriptures. So let me lay this out, what I mean by this. I went to a group of high school students recently, and I said, describe for me physical actions that communicate things without words. So we talked about a slap, a punch, a kiss on the cheek, meaning something different than a kiss on the forehead. One is equal, one is a blessing. We talked about a wink communicates something. Now, some of these are cultural, some of these are transcultural. I said, what about a French kiss? At that point, they're all like, yeah, a kiss on the lips could be a holy greeting, even between men in some countries. But a French kiss, that's romantic, that's sexual. I said, okay, you're right. So if a slap and a handshake and even different kinds of hugs and a kiss on the forehead and a French kiss communicate things just by the actions without words, then what does sex communicate? What does sex mean? That's a great question. There's a quote I put in Chasing Love from the movie Vanilla Sky with Tom Cruise. And one girl he breaks up with, he's going out with another girl, and this girl tries to track him down. And I don't have it right in front of me, but the idea is, she says, don't you know that when you slept with me, your body made a promise, even if you didn't? This is what John Paul II is getting at. So why is premarital sex wrong? You ready? Because you shouldn't lie. You shouldn't lie. Now, what does sex communicate? Now, I'm not going to go into all details, but I think it communicates trust, exclusivity, and permanence. So if you're having sex with somebody outside of the marital relationship that actually means those things, then you're communicating one thing with your body that you're not in your relationship, which is lying. Now, I'm still working that through in my mind. And I'm not saying to be persuasive to a young person for different reasons, but I think there's something to that, we have to unpack with young people. And frankly, it's great to see Nancy Pearcey in her book, Love Thy Body. More and more Protestants realizing, wait a minute, the body means something. And we can't just buy into this Gnostic view, which a lot of Protestants have in terms of our sexuality. Back to your question, Eric, I think one of the mistakes a lot of people made in purity culture is we bought into a Gnostic worldview that separated body from soul. And then we turn around, we want to critique transgenderism. And I go, well, we kind of already separated body from soul. We're left without a holistic sexual ethic. We're the ones who are being inconsistent here. So I can keep going, but I'll stop to allow questions to jump
As soon
in.
as you make the mind-body dichotomy, if someone feels psychologically that they're one thing, but their body doesn't match, now we've got a dichotomy going on. And that's the problem we're having. People think we're nuts to believe that. We're crazies, but I still say we've got the best holistic ethic there is, sexual. Okay. Who's next? You got about 15 more minutes here. Who's left? You guys want to ask some questions? Go ahead, shoot. Monique, got something? Go ahead. Hey, Monique, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, Sean, can you hear? Okay, go ahead.
Yep.
Go
I
ahead.
just want to say thanks for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. I'm in the physical therapy program at Ohio State here. There's been a lot of talk about transgenderism in the past 2 months or so. And I was just wondering if you have, or if you think there's any type of questions that are important to ask in these type of spheres, like academic settings, healthcare settings, mainly to provide gentle pushback, because the ethics surrounding transgenderism in the medical community are pretty concerning to me as I enter into that. And then secondly, what are ways that you think that Christians can be lights in these settings?
So this is a huge question. I'm not sure that I have specific questions you should ask in this setting as I think about it. I mean, one might be, I find it ironic that when it comes to issues like, say, race, we are told, what was the lady's name? I forget, who pawned herself off as an African American and said, I was born this way. This is true for me. And everybody's like, no, actually, biology matters. You're not. But then it flipped. Yeah, Rachel Dolezal. Thank you. Somebody copy that in there. Then it comes to the transgender issue, and people go, oh, no, wait a minute. Actually, biology doesn't matter. I think it's a very fair question in the right setting to say, does biology matter or does biology not matter? Why and why not? That's the kind of question I want to explore with people. We actually saw it this past week. There was another Hispanic lady, the wife of a movie star who pretended she's Hispanic, and it turned out she wasn't. And it was the same true for me. They're like, nope, you weren't born there, doesn't apply. These are the kinds of tensions I think we should just lovingly, graciously point out to people. Why does biology matter here, but it doesn't matter there? So that's the kind of question that I would ask.
So Sean, you're saying basically the last 6 months or year, this big emphasis on racial issues, it's just so inconsistent. You know what I mean? To make biology an issue there, but not in the gender issue. It's totally inconsistent.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know.
And I think those are fair questions to ask. Does biology matter or not? So those are the questions I would ask. If I was moving into the medical field, I would do a couple of things. There's a book coming out by Preston Sprinkle, comes out early February, and it's called Embodied. And to me, it's one of the most scientifically, medically rigorous books, but it's pastorally informed. It's now my go-to book. I actually interviewed him on my YouTube channel. We walked through a lot of these issues there's confusion about. That might be helpful, but I would pick up a copy of his book. It's by far the number one that I would recommend to explore these issues. So I think the other question is just like, how far will somebody in the medical field go before you feel like you violated your conscience? And we're moving in a direction where you might really have to make some decisions here, Monique. And for me, I try to say, what's the most grace I can give relationally without, That's the way I balance it. And it looks differently when it comes to using gender pronouns as it does to other issues. But let's be as gracious as we can, but also realize, like Rod Dreher says in his book, Live No Lies, our cultures move in a direction where it might actually cost us something. So I hope God protects you from that. You seem like a loving, gracious person that'll do the very thing that I'm talking about here. But I also say I'd prepare your heart and mind that it could cost you something ultimately to stay faithful to a biblical sexual ethic.
Okay, Monique, stay on there. Let me follow up with that. So this brings up a friend of mine last night that called me. He's in a counseling job in Minneapolis, that mess of a city. And he said, they want me to use, I can't say the pronouns, in my career, I can't say he or her anymore. It's, what do they want you to say? Anyway, he can't use the right pronouns. The point is they're pushing it so much. And he basically spoke up he's a Christian. He said, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. He said, they all got mad at me. They chewed me out. They looked at me like I'm weird. And he said, if someone comes in to be counseled in my area, you know what I do? I'm going to ship them to you. You can have that transgender person. I cannot do that with my core convictions. And he was very bold about it. And I was really proud. I'm like, wow, you really stood up and spoke the truth in love. He just said, I can't do it. And that's what he told him. And so the question is, Sean, how are we going to be able to do that, navigate that and do that lovingly, speak the truth in love? It may cost us something. And that maybe is what you're talking about.
I think the best example I consistently point to is Daniel, where Daniel in Daniel chapter 1 is told, you got to eat this food to serve the king. And Daniel's like, it's not kosher, I can't. But then he thinks, how do I get the king what the king wants without violating my commitment before the Lord? And in this case, it worked out. So I think we should always be saying, is there a way we can work this out? Honor my employer, find some compromise, show grace, but without violating my commitment to the Lord. And Daniel was willing, when it was all said and done, to pay the price if there was not a compromise that was met. I think that's the kind of person that Daniel was. So I don't have all these answers figured out. We're in new, fresh water. But I wrote a book years ago with John Stonestreet in Same-Sex Marriage, and a businessman said to us, he said, what if somebody's a photographer and they're asked to photograph or like film a same-sex wedding? He said, well, why don't you put up a sign that says, we film all weddings, or we'll film same-sex weddings, but all the proceeds go to Focus on the Family. I'm like, that's a pretty creative way to just be like, all right, I'll do it, but know exactly what you're getting into, and you are funding this organization you stand against. I'm not saying that fixes everything, but I think we ought to try hard for wisdom and creativity. So the last step is it costs us something, but there's a good chance it's heading that direction, and we may not be able to resist it.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's really helpful.
Thanks, Monique. Great question. Okay, maybe one or two more. We're about 9 minutes left. I'm going to get Sean out here right at 8:30 my time. Anyway, who's next? Anybody?
Hey, I got a question.
Charles, go ahead.
Raising children in this day and age, and I know you're probably not going to be able to give me an exact answer, but maybe you could give me some insight into this question. I once heard that our children, that parents are a children's first teacher. With this now society in introducing our children, or coming up with scenarios to introduce our children to a lot of these sexual topics, how do we have a biblically based conversation so that we are sticking to the scripture and truly training up a child in the way they should go, or in this case, in the way they should think about sexual conversations? Because I don't know, for me, just thinking about that, even just having the gentleman that asked the question earlier, it was just like, hold on, wait a minute, I have my kids around, and it just becomes, that's a very difficult conversation to have.
I love this question, Charles. Thank you. I would say a few things. I would say, number one, we have to start young and early. In fact, believe it or not, sex education for the kids starts as soon as they are out of the womb. How we talk about their bodies, the comfort we have around their bodies, the way we touch them appropriately, is training them to interact with and use their bodies in a certain fashion. So I understand the conversation earlier with a 10-year-old and the M word. Like, I get that. That's on the cusp of like, do they need to know what that is or not? But I would say with young kids, like, don't call it a ding dong. Don't call it a wee wee. That's your penis. That's your vagina. Let's be comfortable with the names of the body parts that God has given us. That's step number one. Number two, look for opportunities to have these conversations with our kids, naturally speaking. And oftentimes they just pop up in ways we don't expect. So I was driving the car this past week, and my older daughter, who's 13, made a reference about abortion. My 8-year-old son is sitting there. He goes, "Dad, what's abortion?" I was like, okay, this is an opportunity. And I'm thinking in my mind, how do I explain what abortion is in a way that's understandable to an 8-year-old, where I don't say too much or too little? And I said, well, buddy, an abortion is sometimes a woman who is pregnant makes the decision that she doesn't want to give birth to the baby that God has put inside of her. Why would she do that, Dad? I said, well, son, there's a lot of different reasons. And I just explained basic reasons and walked, and he goes, well, how do they do an abortion? I was like, okay, he's 8. I said, well, son, you've seen movies where people are killed outside of the womb. You know what? That's what they do in the womb. And I'm mourning that I'm having this conversation with my 8-year-old and trying not to give too many details, but I also want to give him a truthful response. And I give shorter answers. And then if he comes back with questions, I know he has more curiosity rather than, okay, he's asking about abortion. Here goes my 45-minute talk. Like, I'm going to lose him on that. But that opportunity jumped up. I'm like, okay, let me talk about this with you and give you some context as best I can for an 8-year-old to understand. That's one way, Charles. The other way, when I wrote the book, let me give 2 practical examples that may help. And then I'm gonna have to run. Promised my family I'd join for dinner at 5:30 California time. 2 examples. One is my daughter was 12 at the time. Now she's 13. I said, if you'll read this manuscript and just tell me what you think, I'll buy you a pair of new shoes. She loves shoes. She goes, okay, Dad, there's an outlet. I can get 2 for the price of 1. Is that okay? I was like, fine. I'm not worried about that. Sure. So she read the whole book. We went to a coffee shop, sat down, I don't know, somewhere to an hour, hour and a half. And my 12-year-old and I just talked about the content in Chasing Love. Didn't lecture her. We just talked about it and we interacted. I got a chance as a dad to say, what'd you learn? What surprised you? What stories stood with you? What do you think about the chapter on love? And we just talked about it. Now that works for my daughter, but not my son. And when my son was 14 years old, he wanted to see this movie about the rock band Queen called Bohemian Rhapsody. And his PG-13 had some suspect ideas, but he's 14. It wasn't overt. I was like, sure, I'll take you and a friend and I'll pay for you guys. But here's the deal. When we're done, I just want to come back home and just sit down at the dinner table. And I just want to talk to you about it. I'm not going to lecture you. I just want to know what you think. He's like, sure. So we go see Bohemian Rhapsody. And when it's done, we come back and we sit down, probably 25, 30 minutes. I just start off like, son, what'd you think about the movie? What'd you learn? What was your favorite scene? How do you feel like as Christians, we should think about this movie? Are there any things we agree with? Are there any areas that gave you pause? And he goes, Dad, there's this one scene where he comes out. And this is the lead singer of Queen. My son picked up on this. He goes, and I think it was his wife at the time goes, I'm so upset, not at you, but because you were born this way and couldn't do any differently. He goes, Dad, would they have said that in the 80s? I was like, no chance they would have said that. Good for you for picking up on it. I was like super proud of him in that moment, but we just talked about it. So I don't believe it's like, oh, they're 12. It's time to have the sex talk, although there might be formal times to have that talk. I'm looking for opportunities that pop up and I stop, age appropriate, talk with my kids about it. And that's how they learn a lot of how to think and approach about ideas of sexuality. So that's one way. By the way, in the book, it's actually 30 chapters. And I thought, you know what, if there's a parent who wants to take it through with a kid, each chapter, you can read it in like 5 minutes. If you like give your kid the 1-month challenge and say, I just want you to read a chapter a day When you're done, reward them or do something special, whatever, and talk to you about it. That's an easy, natural way to build in a tool for parents. I would never have organized the book that way before I was a parent and asked myself, what would be helpful to me? Hopefully, I assume that'd be helpful to other people. So that's the start of it. By the way, Charles, one other book my parents actually wrote together. It's called, I think it's called Straight Talk on Sex. If you search like Straight Talk, Sex, McDowell, Josh and Dottie together, it's all about how to practically do this. So that'd be a tool that would be helpful if you want to look that up. It's Harvest House, Straight Talk on Sex, I think around 2012. You're muted, Eric. Buddy. You're muted, man. Eric, can you hear me? Am I muted? You're muted. There you go.
Darn. Sean, thank you so much. It's so fun to be muted. It's the joy of Zoom calls. Thank you so much for coming on. Everybody get his new book, Chasing Love, and check out his website. He's got so many cool clips on there interviewing so many good people, great scholars. So, John, thanks for your time. I'll follow up with you by email, but God bless you and your ministry, and take care.
Thanks for inviting me on. This has been a treat. It was a blessing. Have a great
Sean,
evening.
you take care of yourself. God bless your family. Okay, take care. Everyone, I'm staying on still. All right, bye. All right, I'm still on. Okay, he's gone. He's gone. He vanished. All right.
The
So
rapture.
the conversation continues. No, anyway, anybody else want to chat about anything? I'm not Sean, but we can talk about any other things that he brought up. If you want to dive into anything else, we got a little time here. I got him for an hour, so I figure an hour is better than nothing, right? He's a busy guy. Anyway, anybody else want to chat about anything?
Hey, Eric.
Yeah.
Hey, I would have loved to ask him if he has a go-to.
Why didn't you ask him? You had time. Okay, go ahead.
No, I was going to be the last. I was trying to get in, but what if he has a go-to quote he gives people if they ask him about like, what about like intersex people or those people that are born with ambiguous, we're really not sure how doctors have
It's
to
like
decide.
a tiny amount of people, right? You mean the percentage is so low, but you mean how do you?
Yeah, well, it's not as low as I once thought, and there are different expressions I didn't realize. I'm not saying there's like 100 different genders, but there's definitely some, chromosomal differences and stuff. And I don't know if anyone here would have a good answer. I mean, I'm sure whatever you're born into, you're called to purity, and the only verse I can think of that might address it is when the one verse is when Jesus said that, some men are born eunuchs and some are made eunuchs by men and some choose to be eunuchs for the kingdom of God. And I know it's about purity, but I think that's, what do you do with that?
He mentions that in his book
He does.
briefly. I know.
Okay.
I don't think he deals with it extensively.
Okay.
I'd be willing to imagine that Preston Sprinkle deals with it in his new book. And I tried to get Preston Sprinkle to come on our calls. I can't get him. That's a long story. But there's resources out there on how to deal with it. I just would have to find it and go after it. But one thing Sean mentioned. Well, anyway, I'll have to find something on. There's resources out there, but it's not as. I don't really think we're dealing with that. I mean, as much as the other stuff, you know what I mean? Like the people that are trans.
But you want to know what to say.
It doesn't come up in any of my conversations, like zero. But the most trans people I see, it's always the guy wanting to be the female. I never see the other way around ever. What about you, Monique? I mean, do you agree? At Ohio State, I've seen that a lot. At least the guy that thinks he's not a male. Do you see it the other way ever?
I've actually seen it quite a few times, like both ways. It's more
both ways.
Yeah.
Okay.
I won't go into any more details about people I know personally, but
yeah,
it's becoming a really big issue in the academic realm, but also healthcare. You're going to be treating these patients that have legitimate problems, and I just think it's really important for Christians to know what to do in those situations from a professional standpoint, but then also like wanting to love this person well with truth as well and grace.
Well, the problem with gender dysphoria is, as we know, it's it's a mental, I mean, you know, it's something mentally that's not right. And so you're trying to be compassionate, you know what I mean? And know that's there, but how do we deal with it? You know, as we're trying to get them to see the mind and the body go together and not split them apart, you know, and it's going to be tough to navigate. We're going to need, I think we're going to need some very serious studying and resources and really crack down on our studying and make sure we're not giving superficial answers and
Yeah.
trying to give answers that are not good and just trying to sugarcoat it and trying to, like you said, push back gently. But, you know, like the particular individual I spoke of last night, you know him, he went to, I'm not going to mention, he's on our call, I don't think, but he's in a counseling area up in Minneapolis, and they're pushing it all on him. And he's just like, listen, I can't affirm that. I just can't do it. My worldview won't allow me to do that, you know, and they're all mad at me. He's like, but I'm sorry. You know, he just flat out stood up for his convictions right in the middle of the thing. His classmates don't understand him. The teacher doesn't understand him. And he had to do what he did, you know, but he just said, listen, if someone comes to me, they're trans and I'm counseling, I'm going to give them to you guys, you know. I'm like, I don't want to, I can't really just take that person and affirm that, you know what I mean? And so it's very complex, as you're saying. I think it's a very complex issue.
Yeah.
Eric, can I speak to Carla's like question real quick?
Absolutely.
Carla, something I found is that we shouldn't act like or treat people who are intersex and people who are trans the same way, because intersex people, by and large, in my experience, do not appreciate being lumped in with people who are transgender. And a lot of intersex people that I've talked to would actually prefer to know what their biological sex is so that they would not feel confused. But a lot of them are not appreciative of like allies who try to apply like how we or how they would approach like people who are transgender, and then say, oh well, you're intersex, so like it's basically the same thing and you have the same issues, and it's not, because one is I mean they're very different. So I don't know, as far as purity, maybe how that conversation would be different, but I know don't bring or like mention transgenderism in the conversation. They won't really appreciate that.
I just
Thank you.
haven't dealt with anybody with that issue. That's why I couldn't speak to it, that particular issue. So I don't act like I know anything, because I don't. I just haven't had it come up personally. So that's great advice, because I wouldn't know that.
Thanks for sharing, Petra. When I was at EPS, I did hear a speaker talk about the gender dysphoria, and I think it used to be in the Psychological Journal as a disorder. But one of the points he made is that when you have a person that has anorexia or bulimia, if you've got someone, and let's just say they're down to like 90 pounds or something, and they come to you and say, oh, I just feel like I'm so fat. You know, the worst thing we can say to that person is, oh yeah, you are fat. I totally affirm the way you feel. And why don't you fast for a while? And why don't you throw up? Or, you know, that would be horribly wicked of us to do that. And so he kind of made the point, when someone comes to you and just says, oh, I just feel like I should be the opposite gender or this or that. You know, why are we doing that with people that are speaking against their biology? You know, it's not helpful, and it's actually hurtful, would be his point, I guess.
You know, I was thinking, we have Christopher Yan on that Sean was mentioning. I may email him ahead of time and see how much he can speak about the transgender issue. Maybe he could add a few more insights as well in a couple of weeks when he's on as well. Tough issue, no doubt.
Eric?
Yeah, Vi, go ahead.
I'm kind of curious. In his book, does he deal with bisexuality?
Bisexuality.
I have two grandsons, and their friends, they come to me, we're very close. They're in their early 20s, and a lot of their friends are bisexual.
Yeah, I don't think he talks about that one a lot, Vi. I think he deals with a lot of issues, but that one, I don't recall being a chapter on that or anything. Yeah, I don't think so. You know what I mean? You would be good to be on the call, Christopher Jan coming up, the one he mentioned, that would be a good call to be on for that. We'll talk about that with him because, he's coming from he's a gay background, and he's read this book called Holy Sexuality. So yeah, I think that'd be a good book a good question for him in a couple weeks when he comes on, because I'm sure he knows a lot about that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I just don't think he mentions it that much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Eric,
But yeah, Moni, go ahead.
it looked like Travis in the chat had a question.
Travis, do you have a question? I'm going up. Where is it? Is there a way to raise hand or something? I don't want to just start talking over people.
Sorry. Can you hear
Go
me?
ahead, Travis, just talk. You're fine.
Yeah. Okay.
I know who you are, but we've never
Yeah.
met personally, but go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah, you're
Perfect.
fine.
Okay. I actually didn't have a question. I was going to comment on the intersex thing. So I guess we're
Yeah,
kind
go
of
ahead.
jumping back to that. A few things. I think Carla had mentioned there's a lot more than you had thought there were. A part of what that is they're including any disorder of sexual development as intersex condition. That's the intersex category has been broadened out so that even people who are not ambiguous, they're clearly male or clearly female, are considered intersex because there was some disorder of sexual development. That's how they get that large number. When you only narrow it down to people that are ambiguous, it is a very tiny fraction of a percent. And as far as an answer for that, there's a couple of answers that I tend to give. First off, what I try and do is narrow down what the sex distinctions are. And what people tend to do is they confuse the expression of that physically with what the distinction is. And male and female biologically across all species has to do with the reproductive process. The male is the one who fertilizes and provides, to use a technical term, a mobile gamete that fertilizes the egg. The female produces the eggs, and in most mammalian species carries the young. That's the main distinction between male and female. And all the physical expressions of that, the womb, the uterus, the penis, those are simply the biological organisms by which that distinction is expressed. That's how it functions. So it's about a larger system. So I try and go into that with people where, okay, so just because someone has a disorder in their development doesn't change that. There's one of three things a person can have with their sexual reproductive system. Either they fulfill the function of the male, they provide the fertilization, or they fulfill the function of the female, where they carry the young, or they're infertile. There is no other option. And so either they're male or they're male or female, and they can be infertile as well. But there is no third gender called intersex, if that makes any sense. But I think Petra, I believe, made a really good point that I often bring up, that this is completely irrelevant to the trans issue. Because if you ask a trans person, so does there have to be any sort of intersex condition? They'll say absolutely not. Of course not. That's not a requirement in any way to be trans. And then if you ask, okay, so does having an intersex condition make someone trans? Well, no, of course not. It doesn't. So I find that's normally something that's just thrown out there to confuse the conversation and muddy the waters more than it is to actually have a dialogue about what transgenderism is and gender dysphoria. So that was a lot, but that's kind of what I want to jump in there and talk about. So
Thank you.
No, that's great.
I have a question, Eric.
Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, I'm struggling with like Allison Felix, who is one of the greatest Olympians and the greatest female sprinter of all times. And unfortunately, I just don't know how to understand this. Nearly 300 high school boys could beat the fastest female sprinter in the world. So now that we have transgenders in girls' sports, I don't know how that's going to play out, but there's distinct differences between a male and a female. Even if they had hormones in, I don't know. I don't
have
know.
larger hearts.
Yeah, larger hearts.
Fast twitch nerves.
Yeah, fast twitch muscle fibers. Yeah, bigger heart. Yeah, bigger lungs.
Yeah.
So I don't know how this is all going to play out, but it's going to be, I think, really tough for the people like Allison Felix, for example, who clearly there's men that could beat her now because of the way their body is developed. So, am I making sense?
Yeah, I agree. like I said, like Sean said, I asked Sean about the transgender issue because I know it's been in the news a lot the last couple of weeks, and I know it's going to get, it's going to be a lot going on with that, and so we're going to have to figure out how to navigate this. And I felt like the church was not ready for when the same-sex marriage, all that came to the forefront. Everyone was like, oh, we're freaking out, I don't know what to do. That kind of just got dwarfed by the transgender thing just came along. Now it's like, boom, here we are with another big issue. And so we're not really sure how to address it, and so I think we've got to really be equipped and use good arguments, truth, compassion, and just not give superficial answers. But we've really got to think about how to navigate this. And so I agree. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely differences. I'm with you 100%. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I could maybe.
Who's that? I can't see.
It's your old pal, Chris.
Oh, Chris, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Brad Pitt.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Anyway, bad joke. Go ahead. I had to say it.
Just regarding the intersex thing, if you think about it, like just from a philosophical perspective, I think another gentleman was just saying that, transgenderism isn't the same thing, because transgenderism has to deal with like a dichotomy, like you were saying, between the mental life and the biological life.
Right.
And there's a split between those two things. And with intersex, you have, that's hermaphroditism, right? That's the same thing. A hermaphrodite, the person that has both
genitalia,
parts, both genitalia. Yeah. So so it wouldn't be the same thing. So we would have to know, well, what is a man, what is a woman? And in order to get that philosophically, we would have to understand what universal principles are available for us in defining what things are. So Eric and I both went to SES, which is a Thomistic seminary, and at Southern Evangelical, we learn about the thought of Thomas Aquinas, who uses Aristotle, and in that philosophical jargon, we learn about things like essences and natures, where things have a nature or an essence, and things are defined as they are by means of that nature or essence. So a cat is a cat because the cat has the essence of felininity, and a dog is a dog because a dog has the essence of canininity, or porcinity for a pig. And for human beings, I can't remember what my professor said, but I emailed my professor a couple of weeks ago. A friend and I were having a discussion. Well, how do we define what a male and a female are, philosophically? And because if human beings have if we have this essence, this universal essence called human, how do we account for male and female? Is there an essence male and essence female that's universal and unshakable? Because if that's the case, then Jesus as a man only died for men and not women. And we don't want to believe that. My professor gave me a really good answer to it. I don't remember everything that he said because it's got a lot of jargon and I didn't really meditate on it, but I will forward it to Eric and perhaps he can share it with you guys. The bottom line of it though is, like what Eric said, we need to be able to understand how to define a human being, and we need to understand how to define what a male and a female are, not strictly in a biological sense, but in a metaphysical sense. In other words, if we can talk about the universal objective thing called an essence or a nature of what defines a thing as it is. And another philosophical term for that is called a thing's quiddity, which just is a Latin word that means what. We heard the term quid pro quo, with the impeachment trial a year ago, or quid pro Joe. You may have heard that with the Ukrainian scandal, but just the Latin word quid means what, and quiddity, a thing's quiddity will actually define what it is. And so we learn what these things are through normative experience. And this is a really big philosophical question, because later philosophy will actually deny the reliability of sense perception and the ability of us to actually know what things are by means of sense experience. We give that thanks to David Hume and the later skeptics. But if we go back to these universal first principle ideas from philosophy that we get from Aristotle and Aquinas and others, if we can know exactly what a human being is, what a male is, what a female is, and how biology and the soul fit together in a form, matter, composition. Aristotle calls it hylomorphism. Again, there's a lot of jargon involved with it, but just so you guys know that there are solutions to this problem, but it's going to take some rigorous study and research and deep thinking, like Eric said, because we can't just throw the Bible at people. We're going to need to get down to first principles of philosophy to be able to talk with people about what is commonly known to us all through our reason and through human experience. Okay, so I said a whole lot, and I'll just
Well,
leave it.
Chris, let me build on that. So, but Chris knows this too. The challenge is for all of us is that our culture, Chris knows this, but culture does not think deeply. Sadly, now we can't be that way. We have to think deeply because we're made in the image of God. We're disciples of Jesus. We're called to love God with our minds. But the culture is so just feeling. I mean, a lot of it's feeling oriented. It's just emotional. It's just like trying to get these things, explain them to people is just, it's hard because we just don't train people to think this way anymore. And it's hard, we have to, I mean, my kids are homeschooled, Chris's kids are homeschooled, there's a lot of logic and philosophy they learn and stuff, but I mean, I'm not saying you can't learn anything in a public school, but they generally don't teach logic anymore, as we know. And so it's just very hard to get people to these issues, to get them to understand them. So I don't know. We've got a long road ahead of us, as I might say. I would think Chris would agree. But
Final thought on that. Just one of the law of identity that Aristotle gives us is a thing is what it is. A is A. And if that's true, and we can apply that to the objects of our sensible experience. If you want to know what a tree is a tree. And so these are questions, Eric has, I'm sure, taught you guys about metaphysics and epistemology, the theory, right? I know
not on these calls. I did.
He's got a whole PowerPoint. He's got a PowerPoint for everything. You guys have no idea how lucky you are to have this guy.
Well, no, we did epistemology on campus once. I haven't done it on a Zoom call, but anyway, go ahead.
Anyways, but if the law of identity is true and it applies to the objects of our sensible experience, well, then a man is a man and a woman is a woman. Why? Because of their physical makeup. How do we know that? We would know that through normative, repeated, and whatever is normative. When you have something that's normative, when you get somebody that's born into this world intersex, then you know that that's a deviation from the norm and it's an anomaly. But being able to prove that is going to be, it's going to behoove us to get down to the really nitty gritty, these fundamental principles, first principles of philosophy, metaphysical ideas about what is a human being. And we will have to go from there.
Wait, did you write that in the chat room? Is that you? Are you Chris Mack?
About gas?
Yeah. Anyway.
I just thought I'd give it a little, lighten the load a little bit here and give
okay, all right, yeah. Chris,
humor.
I think though but I do have an article that may help everyone here tonight on what you're saying and break it down. It's by a theologian, philosopher guy on essentialism. Would that be helpful if I send them out? Like it actually has a lot to do with the abortion debate too. It impacts the abortion debate greatly.
That would
Well,
be
like-
great, Eric. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll send that to everybody. I'll have Chris look at it first, but I think it'll help you kind of understand where Chris is coming from. I'll have him look at it first, and then we can go from there. And Chris can send us that thing too. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Question?
Dick, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when he talked about, he was talking with somebody and he stopped him and said, well, does God exist? He took them a little bit out of where they were. And I've discovered over time that when you're discussing a question with somebody, I'll always want to stop. And I say, well, before we get to the question, I don't care what it's about, but I ask the question, well, do you think God exists? And get them to answer that yes or no. And maybe you want to follow up, well, how do you know? And that gets interesting sometimes. But if they give you a yes, then okay, then is the Bible from God? We need to discuss that. So once they've established those two things, that God exists, the Bible's from God, now, whatever the question is, we can at least bring in, well, what does the Bible say about that? And it gives us a better opportunity to do that without just being out somewhere else or talking in circles and everything else. Because if they won't give you that God exists and that the Bible exists, there's no point in going on in the conversation because they aren't going to give you anything else. You have to have some kind of something to base your comments on, your answers on. And so I think if I don't get an answer, yes, God exists, the Bible's from God, I'll just tactfully back out of that, leave the door open, but back out of it for now. Because you've got to be able to, again, have some kind of a common ground where you're going to be discussing these things. And so today, if you believe in God, you're in one camp. If you don't believe in God, you're in another camp. It's another world. And so we've really got to somehow kind of bind them together. And they're often surprised that we can give them a reasonable and logical answer as to how we know God exists and how we know the Bible's from God. They haven't heard these answers before. So I think we have some good opportunities in just getting to the very bottom line and starting off with something as simple as that.
Oh, I agree. I agree 100% that you have to start where they're at. The worldview level is the key. We don't have the same worldview, then we're going to make wrong assumptions. So you have to just start I think Sean's question was very good when he said, he asked him if or his friend asked him, that group of guys, the gay thing, like, they're like, what do you think about, masturbation, whatever it was. I forget the context of the Sean said, the guy asked, if there's a God who designed you, there's evidence for that God, would that interest you first? Can we talk about that? Yeah. To get to that point first, versus just, trying to make it so much harder on yourself. So I agree 100%. You got to meet people where they're at, start at the worldview level and see where they're coming from.
Well, we all inherit our faith, but we haven't developed a faith that's our own. So I always challenge people, why do you believe what you believe? How do you know God exists? And young people especially, they're not used to being challenged or something like that. They think they're supposed to just assume it and not say anything. But I want to know, why do you think God exists? Not why your parents thought or somebody else.
Yep. I just asked a group of teens I was teaching apologetics to write down a sheet of paper why they believe what they believe. And I'd say about 11 out of 15 said that because they were raised that way.
Yeah.
And then the backside, they had to say, why do they think it's true? And then they gave me, they actually feel some of them had some good reasons. Some of them did give some evidential reasons. The others, so, but I'm just saying, so yeah, they have to think about it for the first time. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe just a couple more and we'll wrap it up here. Anybody else? Anything, any follow-up thoughts, comments, questions? Sam, is that you waving your hand? Or are you just going like this?
No,
Saying that I am.
I just checked online on the sports. I think both Olympic and the world sport has a cap on how much testosterone in your body you can compete with the women. So basically, you can claim, you can say anything you want, you can transgender, but they don't look at that. They look at the chemicals in your body. Basically, if you're a man, you cannot compete with a woman. If you are above a certain testosterone level, you're not allowed to compete in the women's sport.
Chris, I think what Chris is saying also with philosophy would help, because I think what we're seeing in culture is that a lot of people are making everything into a social construct, right, Chris? Like gender is socially constructed. That's what people are saying, right? Right?
But
Everything's socially constructed now. It's a
Yes.
social, race is obviously is a social construct.
but if you look at the
Relativism,
Olympic,
postmodernism, all of that.
Yeah, everything's
but
a
if you
social
look at the
construct.
Olympic, they don't look at social construct. They're looking at the chemicals. So basically, the Olympic define what is male and what is female based on the level of testosterone. They are based on chemical compound inside our body, which is pretty biological. And that's the Olympics should be throw that out to be more politically correct. So basically, the Olympic is not politically correct. So they can fight with each other, the Olympic versus the politically correct philosophy.
Right.
Well, I think there's another thing going on. There are spectrums for Olympic athletes, male and female, but testosterone levels. But what sometimes the men who identify as women can do is, they can train as a man, and then by estrogen, when they compete, their testosterone's lower, but they've had all the benefits of having testosterone, just like someone jacked up on steroids has. And
Somebody's
so,
got some music on. Sounds good. Go ahead.
oh yeah, that's the background. So that's how they can get around it. Even if at competition time, they have to they've lowered their testosterone.
But that's the technical aspect. But in philosophically, the Olympic basically define that whether you are male or female based on the level of testosterone. So based on chemical, not based on social construct. So that's a different way of looking at defining male and female. Okay.
I think I found that article I was looking for. Okay. Yes, I do think I found it. Hold on. I'm going to put it in the chat room, even though I'm going to email it to you guys. So Chris was building on this issue of like, what's a human and everything, like how we define that philosophically. Even though this is written about the abortion debate and personhood, I think there's some crossover points here that Chris is talking about, essentialism. And so I'm going to put this down in the chat room and you guys can copy that and read it yourselves, and I'll send it out to Chris and he'll take a look at it. And I'll include it on the email when I send out the clip and everything as well. But that ties into some of what Chris is talking about, the essentialism issue about an essence of a person. What is a person? Their essence and the nature of a thing and things like that. I don't think anyway, it might help a little bit, but Chris can send me some stuff to send out too, and I'll send that together. But anyway. Okay, well, at this point, I don't really have anything else to add. Anybody have maybe one last comment and we'll wrap it up? Anybody?
I'd like to offer one final word. I read an article.
Yes, my son, go ahead.
I read an article in Crisis Magazine earlier last week. Yeah, it's a Catholic publication, and the author was saying that we're up against three ideologies: paganism, sexual pluralism, and scientism. And I think what Samuel is saying when he's talking about the testosterone is with the Olympics is they're trying to appeal to scientism there, as one of the three prongs that they can use to promote their ideas. But Samuel's rightly to point out the contradiction that they have with the pagan idea and the sexual pluralism idea. It just doesn't work together. So good job, Samuel.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of work. I mean, people are going to have we're going to have to really publish a lot of stuff on these issues and speak up and have good arguments. So it's going to take a lot of work. We got a long road ahead of us. So I appreciate everybody coming tonight. Thank you for your contributions. I'm glad we got Sean to come on for an hour, even though it was short. I know, but it's better than, Chris, better than anything. I'm glad we got him for an hour. So I will definitely send out the clip. This will be recorded. Next week, before I go, we have Michael Strauss, the physicist, who's going to be talking about the fine-tuning of the universe, why the universe is set up for life. Is it designed by God? Why? Maybe some objections to that. I've had him to High State. He's great. So you don't want to miss that as well. Michael Strauss, he teaches at Oklahoma State. He has a book called The Creator Revealed. One of the best design arguments the most debated design arguments the last 50 years has been the fine-tuning argument. The universe is fine-tuned for life. So we'll talk about that next week. So feel free to join us. I'll send out the info. Any concluding thoughts, comments?
Hey, how do I get on your list? A friend invited me to this one, but I'd like to be on the next one especially.
Can you look in the chat room? I'll write down my email right here.
Okay.
Can you email me?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Right here. Here we go. chabotec@gmail.com. See it?
Yep.
That's my
All right,
email.
thanks.
Just email me and I'll add you.
All right.
Anybody else have any other comments or questions?
I do, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So going back to the thing about gender, I said it in the chat previously.
Okay.
I'll say it again. I think it's kind of important to bring up.
Okay.
If I can find it.
I may have missed it. Sorry.
It's fine. It was kind of just like a general like thing.
As a teenage daughter right here, is that what it says? That's you?
No, I found gender for at least people my age. I'm very, real quick precursor, I'm very thankful to my parents who are, they've given me this ability to like self-assess, so I'm not super confused about my gender or anything. And I'm very thankful for that. Because I've found gender to be a type of coping mechanism for a lot of people. So,
Oh yeah, you had that comment. I saw that.
yeah. So I have never been a very feminine girl. And so that's always differentiated me. And I've been kind of like different in that sense of the term. So when I'm not feeling like my expression of femininity is correct or like it's good, I find myself wanting to use they, them pronouns or be like non-binary or other things like that. And I see in my friends who are of the LGBT community, they are in troubled homes. Like something wrong, like their parents should not be parents, or like things they're dealing with things that they shouldn't be dealing with. So it would be difficult to find someone in that community with no mental illnesses or any like that wasn't in a troubled home. If that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. I agree.
Yeah. So that's kind of just what I think about. I still respect that community. Like I said, I have a lot of friends there, but it really makes you think like what really I don't think this is just the way you are. I think you were made this way because of your situation.
Okay, so yeah, it's that issue back to nature or nurture, whether the environment is the key that's causing it or else it's something that, what is the cause, where's it coming from? Yeah, I would think that there would be, I'm not surprised to hear that at all. I think there would be troubled homes. I think from what another friend said to me, the LGBTQ community is having a little bit of a battle with the gender community, like over, because if you get rid of gender, it becomes a social construct. That's going to create problems for the other community, so there is some disagreements there among them, you know what I mean, about what's going on.
Definitely.
So it's definitely a very it's a very tough situation. So, but I agree with you, there probably are trouble. I honestly have never had to minister to anybody who's struggling with transgenderism. Like I've seen them, I've talked to them, but I haven't had like a long conversation. Like, how did you get to this place? Now the gay side, yes, I've dealt with that. I'm talking about the transgender thing. I've not personally had to wrestle with that with somebody, walk them through that, So I don't act like I can speak to that issue in a good way. So good points. I agree, Hunter. I think that makes sense, perfect sense. And a lot of homes do contribute to your sexuality, and your choices you make definitely plays a huge role. So I wouldn't disagree with that at all. It sounds like a very good point. I appreciate you saying that too. Okay, well, I guess I can go ahead and I'll pray us out. And if anybody has any other questions, you can email me. I put my email in the chat room. And if you're not on the email list, you don't get the information for the calls, you need to email me. I'll put it down here one more time. If you're not getting them, here, I'll put it down here. You can email me. I can add you to the list. Okay. But I don't know who you are. If you don't get added to the list, I don't know. So just email me and I can add you. Okay. Anybody have any other questions or anything, comments? And I'll go ahead and wrap it up. 9 o'clock. Eastern time? Anybody? No? All right. Well, yeah.
It's awesome. Thank you so much for hosting this.
Oh, no problem, Julie. Yeah, thank you for coming. I will send out the clip from tonight. It's recorded, and we will definitely get this out to everyone.